Well, hello, everyone. This is Susan Wager with the MMSA. I'm the Executive Director, and I'll go over a few logistical things before we get started. First of all, we'd like everyone to hold their questions or comments until after the presentation. And if you'd like, you can go ahead and type in your questions and comments into either the chat or the Q&A button, which you'll see if you rotate your cursor down towards the bottom of your screen. That way you won't lose your thoughts, but we'll go ahead and answer them later. And Betty Gibbs will read them, and then the panelists can answer them. The other thing is that we record all of our webinar series, and then we post them on our webpage. So you'll be able to refer back to the entire presentation, including the questions and the answers. And so I will turn it over to Betty, and she will introduce our panelists.
Hi, this is Betty Gibbs. We are starting our second webinar related to ESG, environment, social, and governance. And this particular webinar is focused on social issues and the social license to operate. So I will just give a brief summary of our speakers. Our first speaker will be Elizabeth Friel, and she is a social performance and ESG strategist, and she's passionate about all things conscious capitalism, tech for good, and raw material stewardship. She has been in business for over 10 years and has done work in Americas, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and that's just about most of the world, it sounds like. She is currently with Simpact, and that's a group of people, and she can talk a little bit more about that if she wants. Our other panelist is Deborah Johnson, and she's a strategic advisor and C-level global executive, and she focuses on mining and industrial sectors with expertise in sustainability, digital strategy, business operations, innovation, operational improvement, and financial management. She is working at Stantec, and she's a senior advisor sustainability for the mining business, as well as leading the ESG strategy for energy and resources. So we'll start with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is going to talk about the next generation social contract. So go ahead, Elizabeth.
Great, let's just see if I can get my video up. And can everyone see my screen? Okay.
Not yet.
Not yet.
There we go. Now we do. Now we see it.
Okay, I'm going to assume that you can see. Is it full screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the lovely intro. Thank you, MMSA, for inviting Deborah and myself today. It's really a pleasure to join you today on your second ESG webinar. So in terms of approach, we thought we would try to not replicate the same old social license presentation today, but rather to dive into this challenging topic of social license with a bit of a futurist lens, exploring how social license, or our social contract, is changing and will change. There's only so much that we can fit into this hour together, but hopefully we'll walk away with a deeper understanding about the emerging threats and opportunities, as well as some tools, ideas, and tips that you might consider in your respective companies. Right. So first things first, introductions real quick. My name is Liz. I have been working at this mining social performance game for the past decade, as already mentioned. I've had a couple stints in clean tech, impact investing, and circular economy ventures as well. And I just think the social side of this industry is one of the coolest fields to work in. My academic background took me from an initial passion for international development and political science to business school, but always focused on this relationship between business and society and how we can leverage it to tackle sustainable development challenges. I've had a number of in-house roles, starting in community relations in Africa, corporate social responsibility, to broader sustainability and ESG strategy work. From dusty junior exploration camps in the African savannah to mid-tier 100-year-old operating sites in the Rockies to stuffy corporate boardrooms. And I started my own niche firm out of Vancouver, Canada, where I'm based in 2019. It's called Sympact, stands for Systems Impact, which is what we are all about. It's led by my business partner, Rachel Decker, and I. So we're a think tank and consultancy focused on mining ESG and the S in particular. We work globally, again, as already mentioned, across the project lifecycle. And if you want to know more, I will leave some contact details on my last slide. Now on to the good stuff. So why ESG? I'm going to assume that we are all here because we already know it's emerging, it's uber trendy, and it is not going away. I'm also going to assume that you've heard a few times right now, ESG is our industry's biggest risk area. Specifically, the data shows we've gotten really good at knowing what to talk about and even the public commitments that folks expect us to make, but we're still not very good at implementation and management. For some of you, you may be at this specific webinar also because you know the S in ESG keeps popping up as our industry's #1 most unmastered risk in different ways year after year. A lot of you have probably seen this pretty EY cone on the right more times than you can count by now. So more specifically, local community impact for the past 2 years has been ranked the #1 ESG topics that executives are facing the most scrutiny on. 50% of investors now expect a company's board of directors to be overseeing the topic of social issues in the local community, because this is where social license lives. And as we well know, in many places, and increasingly so, no social license, no mine. It's our #1 risk area because our industry still struggles a lot with quite high rates of company community conflict. The kind of conflict that can cause production stoppages that cost an operating mine up to $20 million a week, for example. Social opposition is a direct cause of over half of our project development delays. So this is really material stuff. So what is social license? This thing that represents whether or not you need to worry about that kind of conflict. It's the ongoing social acceptability of your business activities, especially with local communities. And take note of this word ongoing. Again, it means it's not a one-time thing. It is a constant process to build it, to maintain it, unlike, say, a permit from a central government. We've been using this term, social license, for a couple decades, at least now. It started with Jim Cooney, a former Placer Dome executive, to use the phrase in a World Bank meeting, and the rest is history. It took off. Since then, a few industry veterans and academics have put a lot of work, you can see up on the screen, into quantifying and measuring and developing formulas. But what social license really comes down to is local communities feeling that they can trust you and that they aren't going to be worse off for your presence in their backyard. That means reducing and managing your negative impact to a level that's acceptable. And it means actively seeking opportunities to maximize the sharing of your project's prosperity and benefits, again, at a level that's commensurate with their expectations. So, big question. So how do we get this right? What does it take? And it's not an easy answer. And there is no silver bullet, sorry, that I can give you. But there's a major pre-existing issue that I think hampers a lot of companies' efforts. And that's that, social risk is seen as a non-technical risk. And we don't adequately integrate it into business strategy or our enterprise risk management. It's not properly resourced or supported with the right skills. A lot of mining companies are not leveraging a deep and informed understanding of their sociological context to support strategic, evidence-based business decision-making. Their stakeholder engagement efforts are usually reactive, ad hoc. Their community investment doesn't really have a lot of meaningful outcomes. They miss red flags in the community or in their labor force, and then they're surprised when a protest erupts. A great place to start is the way you would any other business area you take seriously. Resource a systematic, strategic, and skilled approach that can plug in to the rest of your evidence-based decision-making across the business. Practitioners have a term, social management, and it has definitely been emerging as a professional discipline in our industry in recent years. So there are a handful of key areas where you need to put concerted efforts to maximize your chances of achieving and maintaining a social license to operate. Here, I've put up a simplified social management model. So you can see the high-level buckets where we can essentially apply a plan, do, check, act cycle to understand your social context in a structured way, identify the red flags and the risks before an incident occurs, and continuously improve your relationships with local communities. And we could talk about the details of each of these boxes literally all day, but we need a lot more time. So in a nutshell, first, know your social context. Who are your neighbors? What are the power dynamics, economic drivers, personal interests, leisure, relationships, daily lives of the local people like? And how might you affect all of that as the new kid on the block? So your ongoing efforts after that need to include these 4 middle boxes. First, engagement all the time to develop genuine and mutually beneficial relationships. It's a foundational thing that a lot of companies still get wrong because it can't just be transactional. And it doesn't just mean doing presentations, informing folks about your plans. There's an entire spectrum of ways that you can engage or seek public participation. Know when is it time to listen? When is it appropriate to share information? When should you be asking questions, inviting or offering input? So that's engagement. Then we have feedback. People want to have their voices heard. It is absolutely crucial to have a co-developed and trusted mechanism for a wide variety of community voices to share their thoughts with you about your company, your operation, your plans. So what's called a grievance mechanism or a feedback mechanism, maybe I would say probably your most important social risk management tool in terms of seeing the red flags before incidents occur. Then manage risk and impact. This is super important because contrary to popular belief, a few good deeds do not eliminate the bad ones. The most beautiful community investment program, for example, doesn't mean anything if you're contaminating people's only source of water or showering them in dust every day. And companies also need to shift their understanding of this idea of risk. Risk is both risk to your company from communities and risk to communities posed by your company activity. I think that the global tailings review process, for example, has really brought that to light. And then lastly, we have benefits. This means a proactive strategic approach to employment, procurement, social investment, and I'm not just talking about sponsorship and philanthropy. Finally, monitoring, evaluation, reporting, communication. That means you need to check if the actions that you're taking are effective and be transparent about your performance, whether or not it's working. So going back to this ongoing issue of the ongoing company community conflict. Even with social management emerging as a professional discipline in the industry, things are not improving as rapidly as you might think. A significant reason for this is the changes that we're seeing in the broader operating context that we're all living in. We're witnessing a major global shift that threatens to make the status quo even harder. Public expectations of the relationship between business and society are rapidly evolving, largely driven by younger people who are not only our current and our future talent pool, but they're also quickly becoming our investor base and other types of critical decision makers. So your mining company is expected to go well beyond just zero harm. That's become a bare minimum baseline now, not something to toot our horns about. And unfortunately, a lot of the world still thinks we aren't even getting that part right, never mind contributing meaningfully to sustainable global development challenges. In fact, about 85% of people now expect CEOs to be leading on societal issues, not our governments, not our NGOs. These social macro trends are, of course, affecting regulatory processes, investor confidence, consumer behavior, downstream user expectations, youth career decisions, and more. And social contracts have been on an unsustainable trajectory now for many years, and that's largely due to rising inequality. The global pandemic has heightened those inequalities, as we already know, driving further frustration and resentment about all sorts of social justice and inequality issues. We're seeing social movements that are centered on themes of human rights, labor rights, indigenous rights, climate action, corporate social purpose. So social unrest has become the fastest growing risk to business, not to mining, to all business globally. Society is living in a crisis of trust. That's also accelerating since the onset of the global pandemic. So we live in this era of division and fake news and COVID geopolitics that will have lasting impacts. Communities are also hyper-connected globally with more access to information than they've ever had before, and with more platforms to get their opinions out, good or bad, informed or ignorant. Internet access is rapidly becoming recognized as a basic human right of the future, even if only half the world has access right now. We've got technologies like Starlink internet around the corner, which will soon make high quality internet connectivity possible virtually anywhere on the planet. So there'll be nowhere to hide. The digitalization of our whole world is happening so rapidly. And with it, the transformation of information and knowledge between people around the globe, which is increasing public pressure on things like climate action and leaving companies with little choice but to embrace radical transparency and focus on top ESG performance, not public relations, and to align genuinely with public expectations if they want a social license. Now, amidst all of these social trends, demand for certain mineral and metal products continue to grow to power our low carbon future. Operators still have to navigate ever lower grades, more remote ore bodies, high degrees of competition, challenges in accessing capital. Add the layer of an aging workforce where some of our most experienced experts are retiring, and we don't have enough new talent to fill those shoes because our industry is struggling to attract and retain young people, skilled young people, especially, the millennials and the Gen Zs that are so sustainability oriented. So in this context, you start to see license to operate connects to a plethora of ESG and non-ESG issues all in one place. So we need to stop looking at and tackling the subject in a siloed way. How well a company understands and manages the breadth of human aspects related to your business directly influences community acceptance, your ability to woo top talent, investor confidence, the pace and success rates of your regulatory processes, your market valuation, and the overall public opinion of your company. So collectively, this means we urgently need to innovate. Global technology advancement and ESG issues are profoundly connected. And that is where I think the advent of Mining 4.0 presents a critical opportunity. So there are clearly a lot of ingredients that go into social license, but I want to draw your attention to a few key themes from the community perspective that have historically been a really big part of it, that the industry already struggles with, that will become increasingly challenging as our industry, along with the rest of our world, continues on this digitalization journey. First, it's this ongoing trust deficit. Communities still often don't trust mining because we struggle with that ugly legacy. Terrible incidents still pop up in the headlines, and we live in this age of misinformation where that trust deficit goes beyond our industry. On this, transparency and authenticity are going to be a huge opportunity for companies. We need to learn to not be so afraid of, especially the transparency piece. Next, one of the ways the companies have historically and most commonly secured social acceptability is to offer jobs. These are often lower skilled jobs because education levels tend to be lower in remote communities. So because of automation and the streamlining of manual or inefficient processes, the mine of the future is going to be a lot less labor intensive. And that's going to require different and higher skills a lot of the time. So in many contexts, there will likely be less local employment opportunities. These new skills profiles will be even harder for local community members to try to catch up with and compete on because the digital divide is so substantial between urban and rural populations. So relying on attrition, the way a lot of us are hoping is going to work, won't be sufficient because the net dollar flow into local homes and businesses will reduce and it will be felt. Then you have the fact that 70% of mining companies are considering remote operating centers. That will geographically shift the skills base and the economic activity away from the mine site, usually to urbanized centers with large talent pools, better livability, infrastructure. And again, this translates into a direct, tangible economic loss to local communities. So what's going to fill that gap? This brings me to the third, the heightened public expectation for companies to make more significant commitments and actions towards sustainable development and community resilience. Smart companies are already thinking seriously about how to respond to these growing global calls to define a social purpose beyond profit and to measurably contribute to solving our collective grand challenges. This means building capacity to do more than old school corporate philanthropy to become a true development partner. So it's clear we need to get serious and creative about transparency and positive lasting impact and integrated social risk management. But this brings me to my last piece of theory that I think is really essential to mention when we're thinking about planning for the future. Even though there are entire courses that can and should be taken to really dive into this idea, it's the shift towards the systems lens. This is being driven by both socially and environmentally, but it's also being accelerated technologically. So we need to start applying what's called a systems lens in business strategy and management. And this is what ESG integration is truly about. It means moving beyond the silos of your sustainability department or your community relations team, moving beyond seeing ESG as the space where society, the planet, and your company have some overlap, which is the lens that was popularized with the stakeholder capitalism movement, in the last couple of years. Future business success demands we go a step further, that we start seeing our businesses as entities within broader society with multi-directional impact flow, and that society, in the same way, exists within broader planetary boundaries. This is a lens that's going to start to make an awfully large difference in successfully navigating the company-community relationship, as well as all the others I mentioned, and eroding that us-them way that we've really been used to applying in how we see our neighbors, and that has hurt social license efforts so much in the past. So that's all I've got for now. Deborah and I wanted to make sure that we have time for discussion and questions. And so with that, I will thank you for your attention. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to reach out through website, email, social media, or the QR codes on your screen. Thank you, and I will hand it over to Deborah now.
Awesome, thank you, Liz. And to the participants, you'll see why we put Liz first and me second, because she laid an incredible groundwork for all of the things I'm going to be talking about, which have to do with how we build the, let's see, let me get my slide up here. How we build that social license and we overcome the barriers. Am I showing the right thing, Liz? All right, good deal, good deal. So I think Liz introduced our topic quite well, and so I'll introduce me a little bit more. Thank you, Betty, and the rest of the team at MMSA for inviting us and for that nice introduction and so forth. So I have been whoop, back up, there we go. The top of my screen isn't showing, is it? The little bar?
No, it looks good.
Okay, great. All right, so I've been with Stantec just about 8 months now, but my background has been in clean tech around industrial sectors, including mining, for about 20 years. Before that, I was moving through financial sectors and other industries to find where I really fit. And I found my home in dirty industries, places that humanity needs, but we don't often talk about how badly we need them. And I found that the only way I could do what I do in sustainability is to operate in these spaces that we need so desperately. And as you can see on here, my passion is ensuring that we can inhabit this planet for the length of time of the dinosaurs, which means we've only got 147 million years to go. And that means we probably ought to do things differently. So I have had the pleasure of going around the world in various places. You can see my little doppelganger, DJ Space Miner, that travels with me to mining locations from Australia to a workshop in Zambia. And I love these little Dr. Seuss trees in South Africa. So they just had to join me on this slide. And I have the real joy of working with Stantec and the team there to drive sustainability and help our clients and our internal teams really understand what it is going to take to help the world get to the UN sustainability goals, help our clients get to their net zero goals, and so forth. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about how our human motivations and just we inherently as people are affecting mining's social license to operate and what that means. So we see these, this is similar to and built on the concepts of Maslow's hierarchy, but takes it a step further. So in human terms, we are focused on survival, relationships, self-esteem. And what that means is we want safe communities. We want pride in where we live. We want our family and friends to want to live there. And when we can't trust what a company in our community says about the risks, it puts these things at risk for us. So what that means for mining is that while for many years, mining companies have focused on the lower four, the up to structural sustainability, it's now the communities are raising the bar, and the supply chains are raising the bar. So our customers, the end users of our products, the automobile industry and so forth, mining is now being held to account because, again, everything that humanity relies on, our cell phones, our computers, our cars, everything is based on mining. So what that means then, you know, again, the EY has really nailed their brand with the triangle, but I wanted to focus on this interconnectivity of these bottom, you know, of these first three items this year. Incredible. I mean, it's the first time they've all been listed together. Communities are realizing that they've got the power and they have a view into a mine's global operations. What that means is that if an accident that a mining company said, oh, this wouldn't happen in Peru or Chile, now people in North America are less likely to believe the company's promises for the mine that they want to build in North America. One of mining's arguments for years for not spending the extra money to do those things that other industries, manufacturing, oil, gas, etc., have been doing is their stock price. And with the changing expectations around the billions needed to catch up to current standards on ESG and the goals for net zero and so forth, while those billions of dollars seem oppressive, it's that view of the value chain that mining has that stops once their commodity is sold. And it means that they don't control, and they typically don't even see how these large investments will trickle down to a consumer product. Well, when you translate the cost, for example, of green steel for the average $42,000 new car, it's only $160. So this is why the tech industry and the automotive industries, other industries who are also being held to account for their upstream carbon are focusing on mining in their supply chain. But that's not a bad thing, since now mining has a reason and an incentive to do the right thing. So just doing what is required for permitting isn't enough today in today's environment. Let me see if I can't. There we go. You know, what we need to do is we need to raise the bar on everything we do, because that's critical to achieving our lofty ESG goals. And what Liz has pointed out is if we recognize that ESG, social license, and investment drivers are interconnected and interdependent, if mining goes about achieving these goals with integrity and, there's that word again, transparency, improving ESG performance will also help to build that social license and investor trust. So how does mining raise the bar? Well, if what we've been doing could get companies to their net zero goals, they'd be there already. So everyone knows that we need new tools, and they talk about innovation. But the interesting thing is mining doesn't suffer from a lack of innovation. The challenge is instead an inability to successfully scale adoption, which is both expensive and a significant barrier to achieving the goals we've been discussing. So the tools that are going to make mines more efficient also have the potential to reduce carbon and improve safety. One study projected that the potential for carbon reduction from digital tools is around 17%. Most of the projections I've seen aren't saying that there will be fewer jobs in mining, just like Liz pointed out, but there will be an obvious shift in the type of the worker needed, including fewer in the mine itself. We talk about this all the time. The impact to the social contract from having fewer workers at the mine can be offset by creating greater educational opportunities for mining and indigenous communities. This in turn provides the mine with a potential labor source to fill the new roles. Interestingly, given that many of the areas where mining exists or is expanding have low populations, and the global trend continues to be a shift of population to urban areas, strategically located in-country remote operations centers actually have the potential to balance that negative impact and perception of this shift in jobs that Liz has talked about, but it has to be done right. So now, while it's great to envision this mine of the future and all of these benefits it's going to have, we still have the overwhelming issue of how to get there in an industry that consistently struggles to scale new technologies. So let's take a moment to understand a little about why that is. So we've all had a garden or worked with plants at some point or another. And like a healthy seedling transplanted to real world location that dies a short time later, effective innovation faces its biggest risk in the handoff into the real world. So even though the innovation has been nurtured by a great development team, it's being executed by dedicated field personnel using sound change management that's been developed over decades, and it's driven by a strong project champion, transition to the real world can kill even great solutions. Getting that handoff right is the difference between an average solution appearing great and the failure of great ones. So how do we increase the likelihood of an initiative scaling to broader sustained adoption? Well, getting that handoff right requires a holistic approach that has scaling as its primary goal versus how most pilots today are conducted and have been for decades. The first step is to eliminate the idea that your project is a proof of concept. Unless an invention truly has never been tried before, it isn't a POC. Ask yourself, what are you trying to demonstrate with the pilot? That the technology works? Well, unless you're a true bleeding edge innovator, pioneer, you really already know that it works, or you wouldn't have selected it. So what you're actually trying to prove is that the technology will deliver at its scale, the value that you've projected, and that it won't be disruptive to your operations. Changing the process of how we validate early stage technologies to deliver non-disruptive disruption at the pilot or validation stage requires both adopters and suppliers to focus on driving to scale rather than timidly approaching the initiative as a POC. Now, this shift in mindset is significant because you're now working to build the processes and overcome the learning curves during the project. This keeps people from extrapolating the lack of process and those learning curves to what scaling will look like, which is an inappropriate extrapolation. The process laid out here focuses on driving seamless execution, something not typically even considered when it's viewed as a POC. One way to achieve non-disruptive disruption and de-risk the process is actually to enlist an independent partner to help you through the entire journey from selection to validation through scaling to improve the speed to value, much like you would hire a project manager to manage your construction. So my challenge to you is to look at your organization or a mine you work with. Think about an environmental problem or a risk perceived by the mine's neighbors that could be addressed with an innovative approach or a new technology. Why is it important to solve the problem? What impact could you have if you solved it? Figure out what is stopping you or your team from being successful. Can you raise the bar on execution? How might you treat the project as a foundation for broader change and deliver value faster? Figure out how you can be a catalyst to drive the change that mining needs to be more efficient, environmentally responsible, and respected by everybody who recognizes there are no plant-based cell phones. So thank you. And now Liz and I would like to do what we love, which is why we ended up together, by challenging each other with some questions. And my contact information is also on the deck. Feel free to contact me via email or LinkedIn. Liz, do you want to jump in while I get my screen off and so forth?
Sure thing. So I got a question for you. At some point in your presentation there, you were talking about seamless execution, and that's a focal point of driving emerging technologies to scale. So in an industry where we have companies of different sizes, different ages, I'm curious if you might speak to why we wouldn't see younger or earlier stage companies already doing that. Like, is there something they specifically struggle with?
Yeah, so as an experienced entrepreneur, having been through that early stage of, gee, I've got this great product, and people reacting in that same way as you or I would react to if we went to a doctor and they said, hey, I've got this great medicine or great vaccine. What you think you're doing is you think you're proving the technology. And after about the 36th time that you've proven your technology, you are so focused on the success factors around what is that proof. I like the analogy of a toddler pouring juice. Well, they think their goal, they see their goal as getting the juice in the glass and getting a drink, and they're so happy. A young emerging company is so happy when they've gotten the results that they promised. Mm-hmm. Problem is both the toddler and the company don't see the mess or the consequences of the mess that they make in proving these technologies. Yeah. Kept the trucks too long, didn't get it done in the time frame that was sent. And those, I mentioned that we extrapolate those. Well, that's what happens is the operation thinks, well, that's what it's going to look like at scale, is they're going to make these messes. And the reality is it's because the young company is so focused on proving their technology that they don't really understand that that's really not what the mine is thinking about. The mine is thinking about, how do we scale this? And the mine hasn't realized that either. So that's kind of why that disconnect happens.
Cool. Interesting.
So let me get one for you.
Okay.
In the light of the fact of this potential or perceived risk, because we all know that perception is reality. Yeah. In critical local employment, or reductions to critical local employment and procurement opportunities for local communities, what are some examples of things companies can consider doing to contribute more meaningfully to sustainable community development and resilience in the future?
Sure. I think there's a couple things, but a lot of it comes down to better understanding, again, what is your role as a business in that community, and have jobs and procurement ever really been enough? I don't know, it's a philosophical question there, but I would probably answer in two buckets. I think one might be considering business models, and we're already starting to see this in Canada, around how we do profit sharing, things like equity ownership with communities, particularly Indigenous communities. We're seeing these kinds of models emerge that in certain cases may even make or break whether you get to do it at all. I think there's a lot of opportunity there around communities being empowered and having financial resources to drive their own community development, because it's very important that it be community driven, that it be their vision, because like they're the ones who are there for long term, not the mine. And then the other bucket that I find really interesting is, as we explore this digitalization journey inside the fence, thinking about ways that these same technologies can help folks outside the fence, thinking about the fact that digitalization is happening all over the world, and that the more remote and rural areas are being left behind at an ever more rapid pace with that. So if we want to contribute to resilience in a digital world, how can we address ongoing development challenges at the community level, but also with bringing that technology lens? So I'm thinking about things like ag tech, I'm thinking about ed tech, I'm thinking about clean tech, things like virtual reality simulations to teach people in a very immersed way new skills, even, for example, what it might be to work at a remote operating center, or even for opportunities that have nothing to do with the mine. One company I like a lot, for example, is We Robotics, and they're this startup that their whole model is about ground up community empowerment all over the world, a lot in developing countries, using particularly drone technology, but all kinds of robotics specific to sustainable community development. So we could be partnering with entities like that, for example. I think another really interesting thing to think about, which maybe isn't directly around community development, but the application of blockchain technology as part of transparency in what the nature of your relationship with communities are. Again, speaking to what you were saying about downstream users and folks wanting transparency, we're seeing like Tiffany's, Apple, Volkswagen, BMW, Tesla, like a lot of the automotive sector making commitments around responsibly sourced metals and minerals. And what that means is not just zero harm, right? There's this whole, well, what good are we leaving behind as well? And these kinds of things can be well captured in blockchain in the future. You know, IBM's got MineHub. There's another cool startup called MineSpider out of Berlin. So these opportunities are already there. And what's interesting is seeing folks along the whole value chain in and around mining metals and minerals getting involved in this transparency. We're even seeing banks. I know ING is involved in one, for example. So I think that's a really neat one to think about too. And then one last one that I want to mention also, actually, around using data transparency, big data and AI, especially for bringing different data sets from different types of stakeholders. So for example, you may have local municipalities, you might have a central federal government, civil society, NGOs, the health sector, community leaders. There's a neat technology, the Socioeconomic Technology Initiative that's being piloted in South Africa, which is designed specifically for this, creating a digital space that the mine can lead or at least participate in, where all ecosystem actors can come together who have a vested interest or a role in what community development might look like. So we're not duplicating efforts, so that we can all see the same thing, and that together we're making evidence-based decisions on the future of development in that geographic area.
Exciting stuff. Yeah, some of the technologies that you mentioned are ones that I watch and that suffer from this, gee, how do we get it to scale? Oh, I should just try it. And you know, like the blockchain you talk about in MineHub, great company, great people, and it's going to happen. And we as participants in the industry have to help drive that. Awesome stuff. Good.
Yeah, very cool. Sorry, that was a kind of long answer, but it's just, it's just such a, there's so many directions you could go with it, right? And then that's not even talking about things like, you know, impact investing, and should we be considering other ways that we do social investment, which historically hasn't been investment. If we're not measuring a social return on investment, we can't call it an investment. If we don't understand our outcomes, we can't possibly, like we shouldn't have been.
And that's, you mentioned the automotive industry and the Tiffany's and, the Teslas and so forth, and how they are pushing our industry. And that's exactly what I was talking about, is that's not a bad thing, because now it's giving us the drivers that we need to invest in our industry to raise those bars. So cool. Should we keep going, or should we open it up to the rest of the?
I'm open, but I did have one kind of broader question I wanted to ask you, to go back up to the ESG thing around culture. When we're thinking about ESG at scale, what do you think are some of the specific things? You're talking a lot about scale. What about scale in ESG? What can a company do to better position themselves culturally to successfully scale ESG solutions?
And culture is absolutely essential. You may have seen in one of the diagrams that for the 4 pillars to get to our sweet spot of net zero and ESG, innovation, digital, energy transition, and culture. And culture is a critical pillar. I think of it like an iceberg is the structure, the molecular structure of an organization. It has to be in that rigidity of, so that you can get rocks over the line, so you can hit your KPIs and so forth. Whereas innovation is very fluid. So how do you create that culture at that transition point where, it's 32 degrees, where the molecules can go back and forth, the innovation can get into the structure without, calcifying, solidifying, freezing, and innovation can still flow. So the cultural aspects are critical in terms of making sure that, again, non-disruptive disruption, that when you start to transition your innovation into that solid structure of the iceberg, that you do it in collaboration with people who are open to it, and then you move it into the processes at a rate that they can be absorbed. So changing that culture means from the top down to the bottom, you've all got to be talking the same language. That message has got to get through, and there can't be the traditional disconnects between what corporate goals are and what operational needs are. You've got to allow some of that fluidity to happen. You've got to allow people to fail and fail fast, things like that. So you want to do real quickly a couple of skills that are important as we try to get this kind of dovetailing off of that culture?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really interesting question, because I also believe that is kind of at the heart, specific to social license, of why we sometimes get it wrong. I think being responsible for the achievement of a social license, which is not a license, and that is not a one-time thing, again, comes down to this blend of soft people skills and strategic business skills. And I think often we think that, oh, so-and-so is good with people, like that's enough to make them the community relations guy. And it's not. It means he will have great relationships with people, sure. But that, in the absence of strategic business skills and risk management skills, can be more dangerous for your company than anything. So certainly things like communication, being a good listener, empathy, super powerful, cultural sensitivity, very important. Diplomacy, an understanding of community development or international development, also super helpful, goes a long way. Facilitation, negotiation, personal resilience, collaboration, but again, strategic planning, qualitative and quantitative data analysis, like analytical skills, systems thinking that I mentioned, and also a current grasp, I think, of different mega, macro, and micro trends, and that interplay of how those trends can impact your journey as a company. Some of the things that I was talking about earlier.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
Okay, I think we're ready for a couple of questions from our participants.
Awesome.
Walter says, it's sometimes said that miners want to be the quote, first to be second when implementing new technology or practices. How do we overcome the reluctance to be the first out of the gate in making these shifts?
Ooh.
Yeah, all you.
Okay, Deborah, go ahead.
Because the reality is, I mean, this is, oh man, did I pay him to ask this question?
I'll have to ask him.
So mining really doesn't want to be first to be second. They want to be like first to be sixth. Okay. That's the reality. But there's this whole model around innovation adoption that the tech industry has seen as its Bible. And it's by Jeffrey Moore, and it's called Crossing the Chasm. And so what Moore says is that you've got your innovators and your early adopters, and then you've got a chasm, a big gap between them and your early majority. Your early majorities are your big miners, your tier ones that they do this look to the left thing that goes, well, have you done it? Well, have you done it? Oh, wait a minute, we're in a circle. It just got back to me and nobody's done it. So Moore has a bunch of methods around that, but the number one that he says is, well, you got to get a beachhead. But how do you get that first one in that group without having one? And that's the big challenge. And so one of the, when we talk about the methodology to accelerate to scale, what happens is these early majorities see the disruption. They see that this is painful to adopt, and they don't trust that early group that has adopted it, because those guys have to do things differently. If they did the same things as their big brothers, they couldn't compete. So they're having to try things new. These guys aren't. There are a number of other things, but the key to it is to be able to demonstrate that you can do it without disruption. And this is why I think this concept of partnering, of having this third party, is so important, because now you can teach your toddler technology how to do it without messes, or be there to clean up the mess so it doesn't affect. You can structure the engagement instead of as a proof of concept. You can now educate the mining company about how to do this, and you can then treat it as a project that is going to scale. So I really think, Walter, this is going to be the model that will help us make that transition faster and get the fear of innovation out. Hope that answers your question. Liz,
right.
you want to add on that?
We have another question from Ian, and his comment starts, so Deborah appears to think that the company industry can define the terms of its SLO, while Liz sees it as defined by society. SLO, social license to operate, is by definition the license granted by society. Is it even reasonable to think that the company can expect to define the terms of acceptance?
That's a juicy one.
What a question. Whoa.
I would say, can I take a first stab?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think the first thing that I would say is it makes me think of that systems lens thing that I put up there. I think that the definition and the terms of social license to operate come from taking that lens. How well do you understand? And that was a simplified version, but how well do you understand all the social and the ecological systems that you exist within, as well as how they intersect with one another? I think the basis of understanding whether it's going to be dictating the terms or not, but the basis of understanding, if increasingly informed through that kind of lens, I think you will likely find that you end up organically aligning with what it actually is, but only once you see yourself as within those other systems, rather than this, again, this us, them lens that we've historically had. And I would also say, I think Deborah in her presentation, actually, she specifically said, and this is a really big piece of it, is communities are realizing the power of their voices, right? And those voices are being amplified. So one, the power of the voices because of this broader inequality and the growth of social movements, but two, the fact that digital technologies have enabled the amplification of those voices. You can be anyone and have your voice heard in theory these days. And so I think that there's an empowerment happening at community level, at broader society level, where folks know, no, we do get to dictate this and you're going to listen. I mean, I don't know if you want to add something to that, Deborah.
Yeah, I will say that I don't think that industry can define the terms of social license. What I do think is that we can influence how we're perceived and how we can earn that social license. So, you know, in a situation where here is the minimum bar for getting your project approved, regulations and requirements and permitting and so forth. But here is the bar that the community is going to feel comfortable that their waterways are going to be safe, that their community is going to be protected and taken care of because they're giving up their minerals to you. And do I have a choice between mining company A or mining company B, where mining company A they're doing those extra things to earn that trust and that respect, where mining company B, well, maybe they take shortcuts and they're not investing the dollars. So I think you have the ability to raise the perception of your company by doing things that are beyond the middle of the road steps.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have a comment before we go to the next question. There are organizations. I was reading an article this morning about the Rosemont copper mine situation, and the indigenous people are saying, you know, this is going to be on our sacred lands and we just don't want any mine there. And I'm curious, and there's other people who are very totally anti-mining, you know, never touch the ground, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are about how you would handle those situations.
I personally think that one of the bravest thing a mining executive could do is understand that there's probably some resources that just aren't meant to come out of the ground, and as important and as valuable as they are not above human life and dignity. And I think that that's part of our journey in better understanding as an industry the nature of Indigenous rights. And it's a really tough one, and not to speculate on right or wrong in any particular context that I'm not an expert of. But I think there are absolutely situations where we probably just shouldn't be developing a mine, not if it means that much to people who've been there long before we decided we wanted to exploit that resource. It's tough.
It's a tough balance. I mean, I don't want to speak specifically to Rosemont because I know that that there's pros and cons, and I live in Arizona and I should be more educated on that, and I'm not. However, I will talk to the general topic of it because I've seen both sides of that. You know, we all know about heritage sites that have been destroyed, and there's obviously an amount of respect. There's also the power that Indigenous communities have seen themselves be able to wield. And there's a balance, and I guess, you know, I respect their rights, I respect their positions, and unfortunately, it's not as simple as, gee, that land is sacred, because that position has been overused a couple of times in other contexts, not even in mining, that I could point to. And so it's a balance. And, the good news is we do have a court system that allows for both sides of those arguments to be heard under what the laws of the nation are. And those laws are designed in many cases to respect, or doing a better job of respecting, Indigenous people's rights. So that to me is one of those challenges where there's no, it's a classic wicked problem. There's no easy answer. But at the same time, we have to respect who owns the land, because in most countries, that is the bottom line. You can't do forced, takings and expect to get social license. So it's balance. It's tough.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned takings, because the other consideration there is that a mining company has maybe millions of dollars of investment in a project. And what do you do about that? Are the Indigenous peoples willing to buy out the project? Or who is going to buy out the project and pay back the company investment?
That's an interesting question on it, and I'll let you jump in. But when I was doing my prep for this, I happened to run into a document from 2014 that was talking about all of the properties that had been abandoned because the mining properties that had been abandoned, that because they couldn't get social license. And they listed 300 million, 800 million of investment that had been, totally wiped out. And that's the type of thing I think Liz and I are talking about, of how expensive not getting social license is, mining companies aren't blind to the fact that they're putting this money in there and it's risky because there could be other issues. So I think the investment in the social licensing is going to be critical. I'll let you jump in there, Liz.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it also speaks to what I was saying earlier about the social piece not being effectively integrated in how we do risk management. It's not effectively integrated in how we do technical reports or how we do due diligence processes. I think the vast majority of time, if you did your proper homework and you gave as much scrutiny to social elements as you did to metallurgical elements, for example, or geological elements, then we might find that far less companies end up in that situation in the first place. Far too often, they just haven't done their homework because they haven't thought about how important the social is. It's crazy because we've been talking about social license being so important for at least a decade. And it's extraordinary. I see it with clients all the time where it's like, how did you not know what a big risk this was? Because you didn't pay attention. You didn't bring in someone with sociological expertise. And I think this is a really interesting, bigger conversation in the QP world is that it's not often that we have strong social scientists that are involved in these processes to make sure that those risk assessments and due diligence on sociology and cultural and political forces is adequately being done and integrated to inform investors from the beginning when they're making those decisions, whether to even try.
Yeah, I would just comment at this point that about Rosemont, and they did hire a consulting company at the beginning that did help them with the social part of their project, and they're still in trouble. That's been over at least 10 years, maybe more. So I'll go on to the next question. And this is from Curtis. Following on from the last question, is the SLO granted by the communities in Peru, which are blockading the Las Bambas mine, holding sway, or the company understanding of SLO? The mine operator may have had an epiphany this week, throwing in the towel and closing the mine. Do you have any comments? Are you familiar with that particular project? I
mean, stuff in Peru has been going on like this for a number of years, right? it's a tough space to operate. I think a lot of the frustrations with the industry there, and Las Palmas is not a unique situation, but I think a lot of it comes down to these same frustrations that I already mentioned about folks not feeling that they can trust the industry or the folks responsible for providing permits to allow operators to come in, and not feeling that they're getting the kind of benefit that they ought to. I think more often than not, it comes down to those factors. And then there's another piece that we didn't talk about that goes to a deeper level of when you're understanding your social context. Is it's a bit of an iceberg. What things look like on the surface aren't always a comprehensive picture, and the power of folks that can pull strings from outside your immediate area of influence can be profound. So as part of your mapping, in the same way you might, for example, engage a lobbyist, like say you're working in a remote area of the United States, that you might engage a lobbyist specializing in DC full-time on your behalf, because you know that things that are happening in other parts of the country and in other parts of your political system and your government, how much those can influence at the local level. And we see the same thing in civil society. There's a lot of very active NGOs in Latin America, for example, that may or may not have any direct ties to the local area. So that's another thing to be aware of. Not sure if that's the case in Las Palmas, but it is a major aspect of how social license evolves in the region.
Deborah, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think she's pretty much hit it, and I'm not as familiar with it.
Okay. We have a request from Megan to share the 2014 paper you mentioned.
Yeah, I'm trying to save it as a PDF right now, so hopefully that'll.
Okay, and you can post it in the chat.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting ready to do.
Yeah. Curtis, do you have any additional comments or questions or a closing statement?
I don't have any follow-on questions. If there's no more in the chat line, I'd like to thank everyone who's attending. We even have previous speakers at our webinars who have signed back in, so they see some really great value in these webinars. Deborah and Elizabeth, very, very much appreciate your comments and your perspectives on this part of the mining industry, which is only growing in importance for society and for the mining companies as we all realize a different way to behave. And it's encouraging to see, and hopefully we can find some harmony in the years to come. Thanks again for your attendance and for your efforts here.
And we did have one more question that came in from Francisco. In SLO, there are constant meetings to coordinate with communities that have elected authorities for short periods, 1 or 2 years. However, political differences between the authorities completely change the scope of the SLO. How can this be addressed?
Your engagement needs to be beyond leadership. And I know that's particularly hard in certain cultures. It's especially hard in Indigenous communities, but then you need to do so in other creative ways, for example, through your community investment programming that might get you involved with folks in education or in health. And maybe you're not explicitly having consultations with them that might offend the folks in the elected leadership positions, but you're developing relationships, which allows for transparency, truth, and trust, bidirectional. Transparency, truth, and trust, I should say. That's a really tough thing. And every time that you do have a turnover politically like that, it's really important that your ops team does a remapping, and they do their stakeholder mapping on, say, an annual basis. Every time you have a major change, as with policies in the operation, you're going to want to revise that stakeholder mapping so that you understand, well, what are the new power structures? Again, who's pulling the strings? Who do we need to get on side? How do they feel about us? Develop your strategy accordingly with the new faces in the old chairs.
Okay, I think we're done with all our questions. And Deborah, when you have that, just forward
You know
it.
what I'm going to do, Betty, is I'm going to email it to you, and if you could drop it in the chat, because it's not letting me copy and paste, and I can't link to it. So
Yeah,
I'm just going to email you real quick, and
sure.
we
Well,
can.
yeah, it'll be a few days before I get the video up, but we'll let everybody know when it's up on our website. And it will be part of the chat and part of the information that's on the website.
And if whoever asked that question would like to email me, I can email you the file as well. But we'll get it in the chat, and hopefully that'll
Right,
happen quickly.
correct. Well, thank you, Deborah and Liz, so much for your time. It's been very enlightening. And we've had a lot of people interested in this, so we appreciate it. And we will close the webinar now. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for being here. Yeah.